Hey guys, and welcome back to ScarletSprites. Back at it again today, talking about real stuff. A little while ago, I shared this product when I talked about Mike Chi's RetroTink 5X, and I even paired the two up to show some Konami arcade board captures. I was wanting to take a full look at Axunworks' Jamma Extractor, but I had to press pause for just a bit. The Jamma Extractor version I used in the RetroTink 5X video is 2.0. And I noticed when I was finishing capturing footage with the Konami boards that there were some issues with the brightness. It was really washing out some of the picture, and you couldn't adjust the output to compensate and clean things up. I actually ended up discarding some STV footage at the time. So I'm happy to say today that I now hold version 2.5 in my hands, and those brightness issues have thankfully been addressed. Axunworks has sent out this latest version to all paying customers, so those who purchased the Jamma Extractor earlier aren't left with a defective product. And that brings me to the next disclaimer here. All of this stuff is made by hand, by one guy. So turnaround isn't super fast on a lot of these awesome arcade-centric products. He isn't a major corporation, and he doesn't have a warehouse, so all materials are sourced at the time that you make a purchase. So to translate, you pay up front and then you can expect to wait a bit until he has the materials needed and it's your turn in line. So some patience is definitely required here when making purchases from Axunworks. So with that out of the way, to get started here, I want to show these two versions side by side. Now obviously there are some architecture changes here. You can see that the capacitor layout has changed and a few other components have been moved or substituted in the latest revision. For the end user though, the biggest call out here is that you now have two adjustments on the board. The one that is closest to the VGA and audio output, that controls the brightness over the Jamma edge. That's normally your primary display or arcade monitor. While the other one near the DB15s controls brightness over the VGA or SCART connection. Obviously, you have the two DB15 controller ports that I just mentioned, and there's a kick extension input located right above them. It's nice that the pinout for these are conveniently labeled right on the board. A test and service button are located near the Jamma edge for convenience, as well as pins to output mono audio. More on that in a second. For video output options, you have both SCART and VGA. As a side note, if using SCART output, you can capture both audio and video with this connection. I know a few people had asked that on the RetroTink video, so I thought it was worth mentioning here again. Last but not least, you have two stereo RCA jacks that can be used for audio output. So all of that is great, but what do you actually use this thing for? The first scenario that comes to mind is streaming. The Jamma Extractor is the first piece of that solution. Now, there are a variety of capture devices to complement this. Mine is pretty archaic by today's standards. I'm using the Elgato HD, so for me, I want to feed this a clean HDMI signal. And that's where, to no one's surprise, the RetroTink 5X comes into play once again. So the setup is fairly straightforward. The Jamma Extractor plugs into your Jamma game board, and then your harness attaches directly to the extractor. I'm using the SCART connector in my setup, but you could use VGA and the RCA jacks depending on what capture card you own. I was given a VGA to component cable, but I ended up not needing it since the RetroTink 5X has a SCART connection. Again, your needs will vary based on your own personal setup. Okay, so that is pretty much it as far as hooking everything up. You can power on your machine normally, and this is where you may need to start tweaking the picture with the adjustments on the Jamma Extractor in order to dial in your picture brightness properly. You'll want to have your capture preview up and running so you can ensure that the brightness looks good over there as well. I will note that you'll likely need to adjust this between games. This isn't terribly uncommon even when swapping out normal PCBs, but there usually are some subtle changes to the picture settings that you'll have to make. And yeah, there you go. The Jamma Extractor being used for real arcade hardware streaming with some help from the RetroTink 5X. You can, of course, obviously just use this as a straight up way to capture genuine arcade footage, even if you don't want to necessarily add this to a layout and stream. I will note that some historically problematic boards for capture, like some of the Midway boards, the F3, and so on, don't sync up with this setup either. So if you're hoping for some magic to happen here, you're out of luck. And kind of an intermediary step here before the next use case, those DB15 ports could come in handy if you have, say, a candy cab with just one set of controls and you decide you want to play a two-player game. Rather than switching out the control panel, you can use the DB15 output to simply plug in an arcade stick. Now, I'm showing the most elementary version of that by using a NeoGeo stick, but you could use an adapter to expand your options beyond NeoGeo hardware. Now, I'm just that guy who happens to have a lot of NeoGeo stuff lying around, but you guys kind of get the idea here. Alright, now let's take things a few steps further. This is the Jamma Extractor extension for Player 2, and as you can see, it's its own little board with a Jamma edge. So instead of feeding our signals from the Jamma Extractor out to a capture device or the controls out to a standalone stick, we are going to feed all of them to this little board. Now I'm speaking pretty broadly here, but by doing this, you're mirroring the game you already have running and can then plug this extension board into a second cabinet. So the three connections you need to do this are lined up across one side here. You're going to feed the extension VGA video, plug in the audio from the two speaker pins on the Jamma Extractor, and then lastly, use the DB15 for Player 2 to feed the extension the controls. The extension now serves as kind of a pseudo PCB that you can plug right into another harness. Now for bonus points here, I'm going to add JNX's big red adapter onto this and plug it into my NeoGeo. And this is the easiest setup for me to demo on since it's right next to my Astro City. Alright, so the Astro City is already up and running, so I'll power on my NeoGeo, and you can see now I have one arcade board that is split and running on two different cabinets. This is pretty cool, and I did take a moment to soak this in when I first launched the setup. Obviously, this is just proof of concept since both cabinets already have two sets of controls, but the Jamma Extractor with the Player 2 extension would be nice to have on, say, two candy cabs that were single player only. And really, it would be highly ideal for something like a Sega versus City setup. So I hope I already answered one potential question, and that is, does this work with NeoGeo? The answer is, of course, yes. Standard rules apply though. If you're plugging this into a multi-slot cabinet like my 4-slot, you treat this the same way you would a normal Jamma game, and you need to use something like the big red adapter. And yes, all 4 buttons do work. As far as using this with the Mrcade, obviously if you're just looking to stream, you probably don't need this, and the outputs on the DE10 Nano will have you covered. But if you want to get into splitting to another cabinet or fooling around with control inputs, then yes, this will work. Again, you just have to think of the Mrcade as a standard Jamma game board. Alright, the final topic is kick buttons. I'm going to shoot you 100% straight on this one. I was a little confused by how these worked initially, and I'm not certain that I fully understand all the nuances now even, but from everything I've looked at, the functionality is here to support them. I really didn't have a convenient way to wire these up and test, so that made thinking about this a little harder for me since I'm more of a hands-on, show-me kind of learner. The Jamma Extractor itself has input pins for the kick buttons that then route to the DB15s, but you must turn this on by sliding the 4, 5, and 6 switches to the left. This makes the DB15 reference the kick input that's plugged into the Jamma Extractor and not anything that's direct over Jamma. The DB15 can then send signals for the kick buttons over to the Player 2 extension board and make the CPS outputs there hot. So now you can just plug in your kick harness normally and have support for all 6 buttons on the second cabinet. I will note there is a switch on the extension PCB you also need to enable in order to make this whole thing work. And that is Axunworks' Jamma Extractor version 2.5. It's a slick little device that provides solutions for some somewhat niche arcade situations. I've been contemplating how I might use this in a live streaming setup in the future. I'm not certain live streaming is really my thing, but the setup is intriguing enough to make me want to play with it at least one more time. So definitely let me know if this is something you're interested in and how you might use the Jamma Extractor in your own setups. I should probably mention that I looked at this from an arcade cabinet standpoint, but all of this still applies to those of you using superguns as well. So there's plenty of variability and use cases out there. Links to purchase this will be in the description down below, as well as another link to the thread on Arcade Projects forum about this product. As always, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will catch you all next time. Later, guys.